Hi, this is Tom Fitteman of Ventana Systems with a quick tour of Vensim and building a simple model. I've already launched Vensim, and just to have a clean slate, I'll start by creating a new model. The first thing that happens is Vensim asks me about some default model settings for the time horizon. I'll leave the initial time at 0 months. I'm going to set final time to 120 months, or 10 years. And I'll make the time step a little finer than a month. I'll make it a quarter of a month. And we'll leave the rest alone for the moment. Normally we should spend some time reflecting on the purpose of our model, but let's just say that this is a model of the dynamics of a company's customer base. So first we need a stock of customers. So I'm going to grab the box variable tool, click on it once, and then I'll place this stock of customers in the middle of the white space. And when I click, I get a field prompting me for the name of this variable. So I'm going to call it customers. Now we need an inflow of new customers. So I'm going to grab the rate tool, and I will click out in the white space, creating the origin of the inflow. And then I will click inside of the customer's stock to connect a flow pipe. And again, I get a field prompting me to name this variable, so we'll call this the customer acquisition rate. And I hit enter, and there's my stock flow structure. This isn't much of a model yet, but let's go ahead and write some equations. But before I get too far, I should save my work. So I'm just going to use the file menu to save as, and I'll give this a name. I'll call it customers, and I'm in the habit of giving things a version number, saving frequently different editions of the model under new names. Okay, now we're ready to write some equations. So now I'm going to switch to the equation tool. And you'll notice when I do this that the customers and acquisition rate variables have turned black. They're highlighted because they are not yet defined. So let's write an equation for customers. So if I click on customers, I bring up the equation editor. And if you look around here, we don't need to get into all the details, but up at the top I have a navigation panel that lets me jump to different variables. At the left I have information about the variable that I'm actually working on. Down at the bottom I have a field for the variables that are inputs or causes to this equation. I have a little keypad. To the left I have a list of built-in functions that I might use in this equation, and then I have a comment field and which I can use to document the purpose of this equation. Okay, so one thing you'll notice is that because I made this a box variable, it's already set the variable type to be level, so I'm going to leave that alone. So in other words, this is a stock, and also because it's a stock, from the diagram, it's inferred that this stock has an inflow of the customer acquisition rate. So it's already filled that in for me into the flow field. What I need to specify here is the initial value of this stock. And let's make the simple assumption that we have no customers to start with. So I'm just going to say 0 here. And then there's one more thing we should do for good modeling practice, which is to specify units of measure for this variable. So I'm going to say that it's in customers, or maybe to be more generic, people. So I'm going to fill that into the units field. And when we're done, you can check syntax and everything's okay with this equation. I could also check the model, and it'll tell me that there are other undefined equations here. But I'm just going to hit OK. And now you can see that customers is no longer highlighted because we've defined that equation, and we just need to define the customer acquisition rate. So let's do that. again, I click on the acquisition rate, and you'll notice that this is currently set to be a constant. Let's just leave it that way. So I'm going to say that we're acquiring customers at a constant rate of 10 per month. So this equation is going to have units of people per month. So there's my unit of measure. So now we can check syntax again. This is okay. And our model should be ready to run. To run this model, we're going to use the simulation controls in the toolbar. So the first thing we want to do is give our current experiment a name, and I'm going to call it base to indicate that this will be the base case against which we'll compare future scenarios. And now all I have to do is hit simulate. And the model ran so fast we couldn't see it working in progress. So now what we've done is to create a data set associated with this model called base. And if I take a look at the control panel, so here's the control panel. I'll move to the Datasets tab. You can see over on the right here that I have a loaded data set called base. So what does that look like? Well, if I want to see what's inside this data set, I choose the sketch tools, one of the sketch tools here, the hand or the padlock, and I click on a variable, and that makes it what's called the workbench variable. You'll see it appear in the title bar. Now, anytime I click on one of the analysis tools on the left side, it'll operate on the workbench variable. So I'll click on a graph tool, and there's a graph of my customers. I could also click on a strip graph, which shows me customers and its inputs, but you'll notice that the customer acquisition rate appears as a constant here. It's not very interesting yet. Or on a table, which gives me the numeric values in my model. I can close these tables and graphs by just clicking in the close box at the top, or I can use the Build Windows button to shift back to the diagram. And if things ever get cluttered, I can always use the Windows menu to say close all the output windows. So let's make this model a little bit more interactive. I'm going to put a visual representation of customers on the screen so I can have my large graph visible right in front of me. So I'm going to grab the IO object tool from the sketch toolbar, click on that, and then I'll click here over to the right of customers a little bit. And what I want to do is use one of these analysis workbench tools as a continuous visualization of what's going on in the model. So I'm going to choose Output Workbench tool here for object type, and then I'm going to choose to show the level customers, and then I'll use the graph tool to display it. So now I hit OK, and I'm going to reposition this a little bit using the hand tool. What I'm seeing here is a preview. It's not active while we're editing the diagram, but if I switch to the lock tool, I can see my graph of customers. So that's now available, pasted onto the diagram. So now let's run the model again, but this time we'll call our experiment test. And obviously we could come up with a more informative scenario name for experiments with a real model. And this time, rather than doing a straight through run, I'm going to use what's called Synthesim, which is essentially real-time simulation on demand as we vary parameters in the model. So I'm going to click the Synthesim button after I've changed the run name. And the model is now live. So far you notice on our graph that we only have one trace, and that's because we haven't changed anything yet. But you'll notice now that customer acquisition rate has a slider associated with it. And I can move this slider, and as I do so, you can see how the behavior of customers changes in response to the assumption about the customer acquisition rate. If I don't like the scale on my slider for the customer acquisition rate, I can click on the arrow body rather than the tab and modify the scale. So rather than 0 to 60, I could set this to, say, 0 to 100. And if I want that scaling to become part of the model, I can check this box to make the slider change permanent. And now as I move this slider, I can run all the way up to an acquisition rate of 100 customers per month. When I'm done, I just hit stop. And I now have a data set. If we take a look at the control panel, now you can see that we have two runs, test and base. And clicking these in the loaded panel here, you'll notice on the graph to the right that the colors are changing from blue to red because coloring depends on the order at which these data sets are loaded. So I can reverse them, and I can also load and unload. So if I decide that the base run has become irrelevant, I can just double click it, and now I'm showing just test. If I want to load it again, I click on base in the list of available runs, and I can double click it, or I can use the left and right arrows to manage things. You notice when I load a run, I get some info about its origin. If I can't remember what the differences are between two runs, I can always load them and then use the runs compare tool in the analysis toolbar to generate a list of the differences between the simulations. And this will always compare the first two data sets that are available on the loaded side of the Datasets tab. Let's make this model a little bit more interesting by connecting it to a company's bottom line. To do that, I'm going to create a couple of auxiliary variables. So I'm just going to grab the ordinary variable tool out of the sketch toolbar, and I'm going to place a variable here called hardware sales. So this might be the sales of new computers that a company receives each time it acquires a customer. And I'm going to create another variable here called service sales. And that's the revenue they make off of servicing the existing installed base of hardware and software. Now these depend on the rate of acquisition of new customers and on the stock of customers in the customer base. So I'm going to add some information arrows to indicate that those connections exist. So I grab the arrow tool. First I'm going to click on the customer acquisition rate, and since this is a flow, I'll actually click on the valve, and then I'll connect that to hardware sales by clicking again, and there's my blue arrow. And now I'm going to create an information arrow from customers to service sales, but just for aesthetics, I'm going to make this one curve a little bit. So as a shortcut, I'll click on customers, and then I'll click in the white space, and you'll notice that put a kink in my arrow. And now I'll click on service sales, and I've got a bit of a curve. And if I wanted a curve for the other one, I can grab the handle on the arrow and drag that to move it. Okay, so now we have hardware and service sales, and we need a couple of more things. So one is a variable that captures how much hardware we sell per new customer. And another for service sales. So again, we'll connect these with information arrows. And then finally, let's create a variable to represent hardware's share of sales. And we'll connect that with a couple of arrows as well. Okay, now we need to write some equations for these. So I'll click the equations tool, and you'll notice that our new variables are now highlighted. So let's start with hardware sales. So hardware sales is now an easy equation to write. It's the customer acquisition rate multiplied by the amount of hardware sales that you get for each of those new customers acquired. And you'll notice I didn't have to type anything. I just clicked on variables in the variable list here. Let's do that again for services. So for service sales, I'll click, and this is going to be the number of customers, so I click on customers in the causes list, and I'll use my keypad here to enter the star key for multiplication, multiply by the number of service sales per existing customer. And I'm going to give this units. This is dollars per month. And I forgot to give units to hardware sales, so let me do the same here. And I don't have to type in the units anymore because I've already used dollars per month, so it's been added to a list that Vensim maintains internally. So I can just select that with the drop down and hit OK. And now I need to look at hardware sales per new customer, and let's just arbitrarily say that this is $1,000. So this has units of dollars, and actually this is not purely dollars, it's dollars per person. And then service sales, let's say arbitrarily that this is $100 per person per month, because we need to know how frequently people in the existing customer base purchase some service. So this is going to be units of dollars per person per month. And then finally we can look at the hardware share of sales revenue. So we'll click on that. And this is what we call a dimensionless number, or it's a fraction really. We can say DMNL as shorthand, or we could put in the word fraction. Vensim understands that those are synonyms. And this is equal to hardware sales. So I need to click in the equation field, click hardware sales, divided by the sum of hardware sales and service sales. Okay. Now, before we run the model, there are two things we ought to do. One is we should check our units to see if we did it right. So I'm going to go to the model menu and say units check, because the model's now getting complicated enough that units become a very helpful quality control check that prevents a lot of silly errors from creeping into your work. So I'll run a units check and everything's okay. And now let's run the model, and let's call this, give it a descriptive name, hardware share. Now, before I push the run button, I ought to spend a moment to reflect on what I think is going to happen to the hardware share of sales. Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? We know a little bit about it because it's bounded between 0 and 1 because it's a fraction. But if we want to learn from simulation, it's very helpful to record expectations about the behavior of a model in advance, because it's too easy to rationalize surprises after the fact and therefore miss learning opportunities. So take a moment to reflect on that, and now let's click Simulate to run the model. So now we have our hardware share run here in blue in the legend of our graph. And let's select hardware share of sales as the workbench variable up here in the title. And now I'm going to generate a causes strip to see the hardware share and its inputs. And you can see that the hardware share of sales is falling over time, and that's because hardware sales are constant and service sales are rising. So hardware sales constant, why is that? Well, let me generate a tree of inputs to that. Well, I can see that it's a function of the customer acquisition rate and hardware sales per new customer. And if I look at my diagram, both of those things are constant at the moment. So now let's take a look at service sales. And if I want my output windows back, I can click on the output windows button. So how about service sales? Here are the inputs to service sales. And that's rising because the stock of customers is growing. And of course, the stock of customers is growing because it has an inflow of a constant customer acquisition rate. But of course, it's accumulating that, so it's rising over time the same way that a bathtub fills. So out of this simple structure with no feedback and constant assumptions, I'm getting behavior of hardware share of sales that's not necessarily intuitive. And this model actually has an interesting backstory. It's not just a trivial example. This is actually the situation that Barry Richmond, System Dynamics pioneer, found at Digital Equipment Company in the late 70s or early 80s, when he was consulting with executives about exactly the problem of falling share of revenue from hardware sales and a rising presence of the service part of the organization in the total mix of the company's operations. And while this now seems a little bit obvious after the fact, the dynamics of this system were actually new and surprising to a group of executives running a multi-billion-dollar company. So sometimes great insights come in small packages. And to wrap up, I'm going to save my model under a new name. And that wraps up our first look at building a simple Vensim model.